Hello there, and welcome to the second part of the platformer tutorial. For this part, we're going to start moving the player around. For that, we have to go through a couple of steps. Number one, we will need user input. After that, we can move the player, although for the movement, we have to add some constraints. For example, the player should only be able to jump if we are on the floor. Let's figure out all of that in Godot right away. And I want to start with the user input. Now, for that, we have to define what inputs are possible in the first place, which we can do under project, project settings, and then we have an input map. In there, for example, we can specify an action for the left movement, for the right movement, for jump, and for shoot. Once we have that, we can add inputs to these actions. If you click on the plus, then you get a dialog where you can select a key or a mouse button or a joypad button, and whatever the user is pressing on those is going to be considered a left action. Most of the time, you don't really look through these options, you simply type in the option you want. If you want to have the left arrow key on your keyboard, simply press that one, which is going to give you the right option right away. If I find it, there we have left. If I add this one, we have the left physical keyboard button. But you can add multiple inputs. For example, I also want to have the A key on the keyboard. And once I do that, I have both of them. Finally, what you can also do, if you have a gamepad, click on plus again, and now move the joystick to the right. And then you get joypad axis 0, left stick left, joystick 0 left. This is the left joystick on your gamepad. And those would be all of the inputs. I think this covers a pretty broad range. Next up, I want to do all of that for the right side. For that, we will have the D key, we will have the right arrow, and finally, on the gamepad, I want to move to the right. Next up, we have jump, which in my case is either going to be W, it could be the up arrow, or on the gamepad, it could be the A key, which for Godot is joypad button 0. And cool, with that, we have jump input. Finally, for the shoot button, I want to, on the keyboard, use the space button. And on the joypad, I want to use the shoulder button, which is going to be joypad axis 4 or whatever I pressed. That is pretty much it. With that, we are getting a whole bunch of input. All of that we now want to use inside of the player. For that, first of all, the player is going to need a script. I want to keep all of the default options, so click on create. And now we have a script for the player. And first of all, I want to check if the input is working in the first place, which I can do inside of the underscore process function. As a reminder, underscore process runs on every single frame, which means if we, for example, print test in there and run the game, then we should be able to see test in the output all the time. And that looks pretty good. To check if our input is working, we could, for example, check if input is action just pressed, and then check for any of these inputs. For example, we could start with jump, and if that is the case, I want to print jump. Let's run off that, and if I press the up arrow, we are getting jump. So on your keyboard, this should be the up arrow, the W arrow, and on the joypad, this should be the bottom button, or whatever you specified. In my case, all of this is working well, so I am happy with that. Now that being said, this line I don't really like, because for now, what I want to get is the left or right movement. For that, you could get input and then is action pressed, for example, with left or right. But that wouldn't be ideal for two reasons actually. So, for example, if we are pressing the left button, then we could run some code to make the player move left. However, the problem with that is that, number one, this input is binary. It is either going to be true or it's going to be false. There's no middle ground between them, which is fine for keyboard input, but if you have a joypad, you have a bit more control over all of this. I can actually demonstrate that. If I print input.get action strength, and then on the left keyboard button, if I now run the code, and I get 0 by default, but if I press left, we are getting a 1. So we either have 0 or 1, and that is all we get. However, if I use the joypad and I move very slowly to the left, you can see that we are getting a whole bunch of values that are slightly greater than 0, but not 1. Only if I go all the way to the left on my joypad do I get a 1. And these numbers we do want to capture. We don't just want to have 0, 1 input, we want to have a floating point value. So that if the player very carefully moves the joypad, we are still capturing that movement. Which is also going to bring us to the second problem with what I have done earlier, this one. To get the proper input, you would need this line twice, one for left and one for right. But Godot has something much better inbuilt. And if I go to the documentation and then look at all of the options, the method that we want to use is called getAxis. And this one has a negative action and a positive action, and it simply gives you the positive action minus the negative action. It's actually written down there. So we are checking the action strength of the right action minus the left action. Or in other words, if I go back to the player, I want to use input.getAxis. And in there, we want to have first the left side or the negative movement, and then the right side. All of that we then want to print. If I now run the code again, and if I press on my keyboard left, we get -1. If I press right, we get +1. And that works pretty well. If I don't press anything, we're getting a 0. However, on the joypad, if I move very carefully to the right, we are getting very small positive numbers. And if I go very carefully to the left, we are getting very small negative numbers. These numbers are much more granular, which is significantly better. But still, we are keeping the keyboard input. So this is going to work much better. Although we have to figure out how to actually use it. And for that, I want to create another global variable. I got this one var direction x, which is going to be a floating point value with a default value of 0.0. Or I suppose if you want to be just a little bit more concise, you don't need the float to determine the data type. You could simply use the double colon equal sign to assign this variable a floating point value of 0.0. And that way, this direction underscore x will always be a float. You see this operation really often in Godot. In our case, all that we want to do is assign the return value from getAxis to it. So direction.x is going to be the getAxis value. And after we have that, I want to update the velocity.x of the player, which is going to be direction.x. Now, velocity is an inbuilt attribute of any character body 2D node, meaning our player already has this attribute. And after we are setting this to some kind of value, you want to call move and slide. Then Godot is going to use this value to move the body in a certain direction. This we can actually try, although it's not going to be great. If I now move to the right, we can see we have very slow movement. But movement nonetheless. The reason why it is so slow is because our movement speed at the moment is 1, which is really not great. But that we can fix quite easily. I want to add var speed with a value of, let's try 150. And after we have that, I want to set velocity.x to direction x multiplied by the speed. And now if we are trying this, I can move left and right pretty fast. And you can now see that the camera is lagging behind quite a bit. That we can fix in just a second. First of all though, at the moment, I am using the keyboard to move. So we always have a speed of either 1 or 0. Or rather, 150 or 0. However, if I use the gamepad and very carefully move to the right, then we get much slower movement, but movement that I can control significantly better. Which I think is a much better feeling. Cool, so all of that is working just fine. Next up then, on the camera, we want to update the position smoothing. At the moment, it's 5 pixels, which I think is a bit slow. Let's try 10 pixels, and now run the game again. And that feels quite a bit snappier. I suppose we can try 15 pixels, and let's try all of this again. And I think 10 pixels was better, but we can do some middle ground. Let's do 12 pixels. And run all of this again, and yeah, I think that looks best. Also, this speed I want to set from inside of the inspector, which we can do via adding the export statement. And now, with the player selected, you can update the speed. Now I think 150 is perfectly fine, but later on you might want to change it. Now next up, we can work on the jump mechanic. First of all though, I want to clean this code up just a bit. Meaning I want to create another function, get input. And there we're going to get all of the input, which is going to include the left and right movement. So I want to move all of that over there and then simply call get input inside of process. If I run this again, it still works just fine. After we have that, I want to check if input is action just pressed. And we want to check if the player has jumped. If that is the case, we still want to work with the velocity, although now velocity.y. And set this to some kind of negative value for now. Let's say negative 200. Now, this is going to do something, but not exactly what we want. If I go to the game and press up, we are simply moving up. That is because our velocity is now going to be negative, hence we are moving up, but there's no force to counteract this movement, which I want to apply via another function. So func apply gravity. No need for parameters. All we really want to do in there is to increase the velocity by a certain value. Let's say plus equal 20. Although this should be velocity.y plus equal 20. After we have that, I also want to call the function. So apply gravity. And now, if I run the game, we are falling down. And if I press up, we are jumping again. So that is working pretty well. Oh, well, it's kind of working well. It's not amazing yet. The issue is, if you look at the level, the player is falling down, but none of these terrain tiles have any collision. As a consequence, the player simply falls right through them. We could fix that quite easily by going to the level and for now adding a static body 2D along with a collision shape. The collision shape for now is going to be a new rectangular shape, which it adds by default in the top left, but I want it to be right below the player. If I now run the game again, the player should stand on this thing. And now we can try the jump, and that looks pretty good. Although we can still double jump quite easily. That we can fix though in just a second. First of all though, I want collisions for this terrain tile. And for that, you want to go to the inspector and then click on the tile set. And there you can see physics layers, and you want to add an element. That will give you a collision layer and a collision mask. For now, we are going to leave them as they are, because they're not too important for now. First of all, inside of the tile set, you want to go to Paint and then select a property editor. And after you have added a physics layer, you should have a physics layer 0 available. Click on that. And now let me maximize this. In there, you can work with this square to create some kind of shape for the collision. For example, we can have something like this. And then if you click on one of the tiles, you get this collision shape. Now, in our case, we don't really care about the specific collision shape. I want all of those to be perfect squares. So let me reset the shape and then click on the tile again. After we have that, this is going to be the collision shape for this one tile. And this I want to apply to all of the tiles inside of this tile set, or at least all of the tiles that are collidable. The other ones aren't really too important. Once you have that, if you go back to the level and run all of this, we have a proper collision with the tile set. So that looks pretty good. Although if I go further to the right, the player falls down again. So we kind of have a working system. After that, we don't need this static body 2D anymore. I can simply delete it. Because next up, I want to work, and let me add a bit more space. That looks better. I want to work with the gravity and the jump mechanic just a bit more. At the moment, the player is going to jump as soon as we are pressing the button. But it shouldn't really work like that. Instead, I only want the player to jump if we are pressing the jump button and if the player is on the floor. To fix that, we want to check if the player is pressing the jump button and if the player is on floor, which fortunately is an inbuilt function. If I now run all of this again, I can only jump once, even if I press it multiple times. And that is looking pretty good. Now, you might be asking, how does Godot know that we are currently on the floor? That is because inside of the character body 2D of the player, we have a whole bunch of default assumptions. For example, by default, this character body 2D assumes that we are working in a platformer game, where the gravity is always going down. And because of these default values, if we have a collision on the bottom of the player, we know that we are on a floor. That's basically how it works. You can customize that kind of behavior, but in our case, we don't really need to. So I am quite happy with that. There's just one more input we want to capture, and that is the shoot mechanic. Although since at the moment we don't really have a gun or bullets, this isn't going to do very much. Oh, and by the way, this part is going to be your exercise. I want you guys to check if the player is triggering the shoot action. If that is the case, simply print shoot. Also, for a bit of an extra challenge, only allow shoot input every 0.6 seconds, for which you are going to need a timer. Let's see if we can figure this one out. But don't worry too much if you can't. Either way, pause the video now and see how far you get. I want to check for another input via if input and then is action pressed. I want to check for the shoot action. If the player is triggering that one, I want to print shoot. And now, if I run the game and I press space, then we're getting shoot. So this part is working just fine. However, the issue now is if I keep on pressing this button, we keep on shooting. So that's not ideal. Now, one easy-ish way to get around that is to change is action pressed to is action just pressed. That way, if I run the game again and I press space, we only get shoot once. The action just pressed basically checks the action of the button being pressed, but not the button being held down. Even if the player holds down that button, we only ever get one output. That is a good start, but still not ideal, because if I press that button really, really fast, we're getting shoot way too often. That would simply break the game. For that, we are going to need a timer, which is going to be another node. With the player selected, I want to add a timer node that we can call the cooldown timer. Also, since we are going to have a few timers later on, I want to add a simple node that we can call timers. The cooldown timer should live in there. Once again, organizing the nodes is really important. Now, this cooldown timer should have a wait time of 0.6 seconds, and it should only shoot once, so one shot should be enabled. After we have that, basically, I want to create another variable can_shoot, which is going to be a Boolean value that by default will be true. After that, we only want the player to shoot if the button is pressed and the player can shoot. However, once we have triggered that action, we want to set can shoot to false. That way, if I now run the game again and I keep on pressing shoot, we only get shoot once. Simply because this attribute is now false. However, what we can do via the cooldown timer is with a signal, or specifically the timeout signal, we can re-enable it. I want to connect the signal to the player, connect, and then once this timer runs out, I want to set can shoot back to true. The last thing we now need is if this action is triggered, we want to start the timer, which we can get via the $, then the cooldown timer, and we want to start this timer. And now, if I run all of this, I can press this button as fast as I can, but we only get shoot every 0.6 seconds. And that works really well. Now, just to test if this is working, in the inspector with the timer selected, I want to set the wait time to 2 seconds, and now let's try all of this again. I can keep pressing space as fast as I can, but we only get chewed very, very sparsely. So all of that is working. Although the wait time should be 0.6 seconds. But anyway, with that, we have made some pretty solid progress.